Hello students, it's time to level up your English. Today we're gonna see grade 9 and 10, chapter 2. It's about relative clause. First we will see what a clause is. So at the end of this lesson you will be able to define the relative clause, then defining relative clause and relative clause of tie and place or where and when. So what is a clause? A clause is a group of words containing a subject and a verb. So it's part of a sentence and it contains the subject and the verb. In other words, all the main things are in the clause because the sentence must have at least a subject and a predicate or a subject and a verb. So now we'll see the independent clause and the dependent clause. So an independent clause is a clause or a group of words that contain the subject and the verb, and it expresses a complete thought, which means it can stand alone as a sentence. So an independent clause can be said that it is a sentence because it can stand alone on its own. For example, she enjoys reading. So this is a clause, but it's independent, so it can be also a sentence. That is what we call an independent clause. And the second type of clause is dependent clause. So in opposite to the independent clause, the dependent clause, its other name is subordinate clause. Okay, we call it a subordinate clause. So it also contains a subject and a verb, but it does not express a complete thought, which means it cannot stand on its own as a sentence, and it should rely on an independent clause to provide a text, okay, because it cannot give a full meaning if it stands alone. Okay, keep in mind a dependent clause have a subject and a verb, but it cannot stand on its own. It should always start with an independent clause to give a complete meaning. For example, let me give you an example. Although she studies reading, although she enjoys reading, for example, this is an dependent clause. This is dependent clause, so it cannot stand on its own. As you can see, it does not give a full meaning. It leaves you wanting more information. So you have to add an independent clause to make this a complete sentence. Next is relative pronoun. So pronouns, I hope you know what a pronoun is, right? So pronoun, we use it instead of nouns or in the place of nouns to avoid repetition, right? So what is a relative pronoun? A relative pronoun is used to connect a dependent clause to an independent clause. So what is the purpose of connecting dependent clause to an independent clause? One could be because a dependent clause cannot stand on its own, we should add an independent clause. So to join these clauses, the dependent and the independent clauses, we need to have a relative pronoun which is used to connect both clauses. So it introduces the dependent clause and refers back to the noun, okay, the antecedent or the first in the independent clause. So the common relative pronouns that we use are, obvious, them: who, whom, whose, that, and which. There could be more, but these are the pronouns that we use usually. For example, let's see a sentence joined by a pronoun, dependent and an independent sentence. For example, the book that she is reading is interesting. So that she is reading, the part that she is reading is a dependent clause introduced by the relative pronoun that. It provides more information about the book. Okay, so look closer in the sentence. The book that she is reading is interesting. The independent sentence is the book is interesting. Okay, the book is interesting is an independent clause. It can stand alone, right? We can say the book is interesting, but we choose to add a dependent clause, which is that she is reading. Okay, she is reading is the dependent clause, and we used the relative pronoun that to join this dependent and independent clauses to make a sentence which says the book that she is reading is interesting. And next is defining relative clause. We have seen what a relative clause is. There are two types of relative clauses, non-defining and defining. And now we will see a defining relative clause. So a defining relative clause or restrictive relative clause, it's a type of dependent clause, that provides essential information about the noun, okay? It's essential, okay? So a defining relative clause, it specifies which person or which thing are we talking about. If we are talking about something, which person and which things, and it's crucial for the meaning of the sentence, okay? A defining relative clause is a must, okay? It's a very vital information about, it's very important because it contains the meaning of the whole sentence. So without it, the sentence would be an incomplete sentence, or it would be unclear, okay? So unlike non-defining relative clause, defining relative clause is very important, or it's an obligation relative clause. Subject pronouns in relative clauses. So we use subject pronouns in defining relative clause, okay? Because the relative pronoun connects the clause to the noun it describes. Let's look at an example. For example, the teacher who is giving the lecture is very knowledgeable. So here, who is giving the lecture is the defining relative clause, okay? Because the lecture is very, if you say the lecture is very knowledgeable, which there is a question in our mind which says which teacher, right? So here, who is giving the lecture answers our question about, the teacher who is being referred to. So here, who is giving the lecture is the defining relative clause that specifies which teacher is being referred to, okay? Because at first we have said that a defining relative clause is a type of dependent clause which provides an essential information about the noun, which means it specifies which person or which thing. So the purpose is specifying which person or which thing. So now, as you can see in its example, it's shown that here, who is giving the lecture is a defining relative clause which specifies which teacher is being referred to. And there are other clauses. For example, in the relative pronoun whose, it indicates possession and it can refer to people's, also things. For example, the student whose project won the award is very talented, right? For example, in this also, if we say the student award is, the student who won the award is very talented, whose shows us the possession. If we say which student, we can understand that the student whose project won the award. It gives us a specific information about the student, okay? That's what we call a defining relative clause. So in this case, it specifies which student are we talking about. And in the case of which, the phrase of which is used in defining relative clauses to indicate possession or association. Particularly, it's for things, okay? For example, the book of which you spoke yesterday is on the shelf. So here, of which spoke yesterday provides the essential information about the book, because if we say which book, the answer will be the book that you spoke yesterday. Non-defining relative clauses. So we have said this much about defining relative clauses. So in opposite to defining relative clauses, non-defining relative clauses are not, an obligation. They add extra information to the sentence, okay? So a non-defining relative clause, or in its other name, a non-restrictive relative clause, adds an extra information about a noun but does not change the fundamental meaning of a sentence. So it does not affect the meaning of a sentence, but it just adds an extra information. So this type of clause, it can be removed without altering the main idea. Since it's extra, you can remove it. So non-defining relative clauses, they are always set off by commas, okay? You can differentiate these two relative clause, defining and non-defining clause. So only the non-defining clause is set off by a comma. Let's look at some examples. So for example, we can say my brother who lives in New York is visiting us next week. So in this sentence, The clause who lives in New York provides additional information about the the word my brother, right? Because try to look at this sentence by removing this clause. For example, we can say my brother is visiting us next week, right? But we chose to add this non-defining relative clause who lives in New York. So this is how you use a non-defining relative clause. I hope you are understanding this, okay? Look very carefully through these examples, okay? My brother who lives in New York, comma, is visiting us next week. So in this sentence, we can't say my brother is visiting us next week. This is the meaning of the sentence, right? But who lives in New York is an extra information. We added an extra information. So you can remove it, or you can just add it to the sentence. It does not change the meaning of the sentence, which rather it adds an additional information. Another example, the Eiffel Tower, which is in Paris, is a famous landmark. So, the same thing in this sentence, we can say the Eiffel Tower is a famous landmark. Okay, we can take out which is in Paris, the clause that says which is in Paris. Okay, which because it's an extra information again. So the sentence could have a complete meaning just if we say the Eiffel Tower is a famous landmark. But, as a whole, we say the Eiffel Tower, comma, which is in Paris, is a famous landmark. So this is what a non-defining clause is. I hope you understood it. Okay, so WH pronouns are are often used in non-defining relative clause. Okay, so the WH pronouns are, what we call who, which, and sometimes whose. Okay, so for example, who usually refers to people, right? So when we use who, let's say an example. For example, the doctor who treated me is very kind. Okay, this is a non-defining clause. Who treated me? Because we can say that the doctor is very kind, but which doctor, right? So the doctor who treated me. Ah. And in the case of which usually refers to animal or thing. So we can say the car which I bought last year is very reliable. And in the case of which indicates a possession. So my friend whose sister is an artist is coming to dinner. So the defining clause in this sentence is whose sister is an artist. So my friend is coming to dinner. It's a normal sentence, and the extra information is whose sister is an artist, and we use the WH relative pronoun whose. So now we will see commas in a defining clause. So commas are used to separate the non-defining clause from the rest of the sentence. So it indicates that the information is supplementary or it's not essential. Okay. So comma is used to indicate that the non-defining clause is not essential or it is supplementary. For example, the movie, comma, which won several awards, comma, was a box office success. So without the clause, the main point is clear. The movie was a box office success. So, the sentence in a comma is always the non-defining clause. Relative clauses of time and place, we will see them. So, a relative clause of time and place, they specify when or where something happens. So, the relative pronouns when and where are commonly used for, relative clause of time and place. When for the time and where for the place. For example, in the case of when, we say when is used to refer to time. An example could be I remember the day when we first met. So the clause when we first met, it provides an additional information about the day, because the sentence we can say I remember when we first met, when we first met. And in the case of where is used to refer to places. So an example could be this is the cafe where we had our first date. So this is the cafe, and where we had our first date, it specifies the cafe which is being referred to. So Let us summarize the lesson that we see about relative clauses. We have said there are two types of relative clauses, defining and non-defining. So defining relative clause is essential. I mean, it gives an essential information to the sentence and it does not have any commas. And in opposite to defining relative clause, the non-defining relative clause uses commas and it adds an extra information to the sentence, which means it's not essential. And there are time and place clauses, which are when and where. Thank you for listening. አብሬያችሁ የነበርኩት ሜሮን ግሩም ነበርኩ። በሌላ ሌሰን እስከምንገናኝ መልካም የትምህርት ጊዜ